So who can be the recipient and what is the timing when the tax has to be deducted under section 194J? The recipient can be an individual or an HUF or others, which means insofar as the recipient is concerned, it doesn't matter which category of assessee do they fall in. Like I said, recipient has to be a resident. It cannot be a non-resident. Because if it is a non-resident, then section 194J is not applicable. TDS shall be deducted by the payer at the rate of 10% of the amount. The general rate given for deduction of tax under section 194J is 10%. But there are some exceptions to it. We will discuss this in the next slide, right? But 10% of what amount? 10% of the amount which is paid or credited, whichever is earlier. So assuming the amount is liable for deduction of tax, which means it is more than the threshold limit, tax has to be deducted at 10% of the amount which is paid or credited. So if you pay before you receive the invoice, then you have to deduct at the time of payment. If you receive the invoice and credit and the payment is made later, then you have to deduct at the time of credit. So whichever is earlier, whether the payment or the credit, at that time only you have to deduct tax. So what is the rate of tax? Like I said, the general rate of tax is 10%. But 10% is applicable if the recipient, the person receiving the payment, is not engaged only in the business of operation of call center. So if the recipient is engaged only in the business of operations of call center, then the rate which will be applicable will be 2%. It will not be 10%. However, if the PAN number is not provided by the recipient, now the recipient can be engaged in the business of operation of call center, or he may be doing something else. If he does not give his PAN number, then the TDS has to be withheld at the rate of 20%. And this is by virtue of section 206 AA. One more thing which needs to be considered while applying the rate of tax is, has the recipient obtained a lower withholding tax certificate from the Income Tax Department under section 197. If they have obtained a lower withholding tax rate certificate under section 197, then the tax has to be withheld at the rate which is given in this certificate. Of course, this certificate has to be checked. You need to see whether the certificate actually mentions your name, your as in the deductor's name, right? Your TAN number and the amount up to which you are allowed to withhold at a lower rate. All those conditions of the withholding tax certificate needs to be satisfied, and if they are, then the tax rate has to be as per this certificate. So say for example, a person is there who is not engaged in only in the operation of call center. The general rate applicable is 10%. The lower withholding tax certificate says 5%. Then you have to withhold at 5%. These certificates are given for a particular year. If you get a certificate for 1 year, then in that year only the deduction will be as per that certificate. For the next year, the recipient has to obtain a fresh certificate. So again, to summarize, the general rate is 10%. If the person is engaged only in the business of operation of call center, then it is 2%. If the PAN number is not provided by the recipient, then 20%. And in case the recipient has a lower withholding tax rate certificate, as per that certificate. Let's look at an example to consider this point. So on 1st of July 2017, there is an advance which has been paid for professional services, which is 50,000. I told you that the withholding tax has to be done at the time of credit or payment, whichever is earlier. So the first question is, what is the exemption threshold? The exemption threshold is 30,000, but the payment here is 50,000, which means that this payment is liable for withholding tax. The second question is, since this is an advance, do I need to withhold tax? Because I haven't received the invoice. If you remember, I told you the tax withholding has to be done at the time of credit or payment, whichever is earlier. What that means is, because there's a payment which is happening, the tax has to be withheld at this time. What is the rate? It is 10%, assuming the recipient is not engaged in operation of only call center, right? And that can be made out because the thing is they have been receiving professional services. So 10% of 50,000, in other words, 5,000 would be the withholding tax rate, the withholding tax amount that will be deducted. On 30th of September, the person receives the invoice and credit it in its books of accounts. The invoice is for 80,000. Now out of 80,000, 50,000 is something on which we have already deducted tax. Therefore, the tax will now be deducted on 80 minus 50, or in other words, 30,000. Right? And tax rate will be 10% of 30,000. In other words, the tax to be withheld will be 3,000. So the total TDS withheld will be how much? 8,000. Right? That's how you look at a particular invoice for deduction of TDS. Thank you for watching this video. If you like this video, you can subscribe to our channel to stay updated on more such videos. You can like these videos and also share it with your friends. And if you're looking for material on this particular subject, you can visit us on our website at www.arinjayacademy.com.